The year is 1519, and in a small manor house within the Valley of France, an antique man lies demise. Music, his fingers, once capable of creating masterpieces that would outlive empires, now tremble as they rest upon the covers. Around his bed accumulate nobles and servants, all waiting for the final breath of perhaps the maximum tremendous thoughts that has ever lived. That is Leonardo da Vinci, and his demise will mark the stop of a technology that historians will call the Renaissance. However, to apprehend why this single guy's passing feels just like the last of an entire age, we ought to journey return to his starting, to an international where genius turned into about to collide with opportunity in the maximum magnificent manner music conceivable. Earlier than we dive into this fantastic journey, via considered one of history's most charming lives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your aid means the whole lot to me, and I'm truly curious in which in the world you're becoming a member of me from nowadays. Music, drop a comment and allow me. Recognize. Now settle in as we discover the whole existence of a person who refused to just accept the limitations that others positioned on human capability. Leonardo da Vinci was born on April 15th, Music, 1452, inside the small Tuscan of Vinci, nestled inside the rolling countryside west of Florence. The Italy of his beginning changed into not the unified country we these days, but a patchwork of duchies and papal territories, every vying for electricity, impact, and survival. Music had turned into a world in transition in which medieval certainties had been crumbling and new possibilities had been emerging from the ruins of the old order. His music, start itself, tells us something crucial, approximately the person he would grow to be. Leonardo was what well-mannered society known as a herbal son, the illegitimate toddler of Sir Da Vinci, a success notary, and a young peasant girl whose complete name has been misplaced to history. In an age whilst legitimacy determined everything from inheritance rights to social music status, Leonardo entered the sector already marked as one of a kind, already outdoor the traditional limitations music that described maximum lives. Turned into a man of status in Vinci, part of a family that had served as notaries for generations. Notaries were the backbone of Italian commerce and regulation. Guys who drew up contracts, witnessed agreements, and stored the complicated statistics that made change and governance possible. They occupied a first-rate middle position in society, music, neither noble nor commonplace, however critical to the functioning in their world. However, stays largely a thriller. Some historians suggest she might also were a slave from the East, others that she was simply a local girl. What we recognize for sure is that she gave birth to Leonardo and then disappeared from his story, married off to a person else, even as the boy became raised in his father's family. This early separation from his mother might mark Leonardo all through his life. He grew up surrounded through his father's family, but continually conscious that he was one of a kind, that the normal paths of inheritance and profession music have been closed to him. As an illegitimate son, he could not observe his father into the narial career, could not inherit music, the own family enterprise, could not even anticipate the equal treatment as valid youngsters who may come later. In preference to crushing his spirit, this issue seems to have freed him to pursue paths that others may in no way have taken into consideration. Music, the Vinci of Leonardo's adolescence, changed into an area where the natural world pressed near against human habitation. The town sat amongst olive groves and vineyards with the Arno River Valley stretching away toward Florence. This became a panorama that invited statement in which a curious baby could study the flight of birds, the glide of water, music, the increase of flowers, and the conduct of animals. Years later, Leonardo could fill lots of pages with drawings, music, and observations of the natural world. But the foundation for that medical interest became laid in those early years. Most of the hills of As a child, music, Leonardo displayed the sort of stressed intelligence that each delights and exhausts adults. He requested countless questions, drew constantly, and confirmed an uncanny capability to music, see patterns and connections that escaped others. His grandfather saved distinctive information of the own family, music, and in these ledgers, we capture glimpses of a boy who was certainly amazing. There are notes approximately Leonardo's training, his fascination with mathematics, and his of filling each available floor music with sketches and diagrams. However, it changed into now not just intellectual curiosity that set Leonardo apart. Music he possessed what his contemporaries referred to as a physical splendor that was almost otherworldly. Current debts describe him as tall and sleek with flowing hair and penetrating eyes. A person whose very presence commanded interest. This combination of highbrow brilliance and physical magnetism could open doors at some stage in his lifestyles, drawing the eye of shoppers and protectors who would possibly otherwise have neglected a bastard from a small city. By the point Leonardo reached youth, it was clear that conventional schooling music had little to offer him. His father confronted a choice that might shape no longer just his son's destiny, music, but the entire path of Western artwork and technological know-how. The boy couldn't grow to be a notary, could not inherit the own family business. However, he possessed skills that is probably channeled in different guidelines. Within the 1460s, Florence became experiencing an unparalleled flowering of inventive fulfillment, and skilled craftsmen were in high call for. After careful consideration, made a preference that could alternate history. He could apprentice his son to one in every of Florence's maximum a success workshops. The grasp he chose was Del Hus or music. Workshop become a few of the maximum prestigious in Florence. Turned into not just a painter, however, a complete artist-craftsman who labored in bronze, marble, gold, and silver. His workshop produced the whole lot from huge public sculptures to delicate spiritual paintings, music, from elaborate pageant decorations to practical engineering tasks. It changed into, in essence, a Renaissance version of a studies and improvement laboratory in which inventive vision music met technical know-how to create works that seemed to go beyond the simply human. Whilst Leonardo arrived at its workshop around 1466 at the age of 14, music, he entered a world that could form him in ways that went far past artistic music technique. The gadget turned into not like modern-day artwork schools, music where college students have a look at concept before practice. Rather, apprentices discovered by means of doing, starting with the most basic tasks, and steadily running their way as much as positions of greater obligation. They ground pigments, organized wood panels, transferred drawings, music, and slowly, if they confirmed promise, were allowed to make contributions to real commissions. The workshop buzzed with interest from sunrise to music, dusk. A couple of initiatives proceeded concurrently with exceptional businesses of employees, focusing on one-of-a-kind elements of the innovative system. A single painting would possibly involve one character getting ready the floor, some other transferring the preliminary drawing, a third laying inside the fundamental, and sooner or later the master himself adding the finishing touches that might rework craft into artwork. It was a collaborative manner, however one that demanded the very best standards from each participant. Leonardo's fellow apprentices included some of the maximum gifted young men in Florence. Among them who could move directly to create a number of the most cherished artwork in Western artwork. There was also Petro, who might later teach Raphael. The level of skills concentrated in this unmarried workshop turned into excellent music, a testament to his reputation and the innovative power of Florence during this period. But even among these proficient young guys, Leonardo stood out. Music, his technical capabilities advanced with brilliant velocity. However, greater importantly, he delivered an exclusive kind of intelligence to the paintings, in which others may replica what they saw. Leonardo wondered why matters appeared as they did. He dissected the mechanics of vision, studied the conduct of light, music, and commenced to increase theories about how artwork should extra-flawlessly capture the fact of the natural global. Himself, music, become quick to understand Leonardo's first-rate abilities. The grasp commenced giving his younger apprentice more and more vital obligations, allowing him to paintings on huge quantities of fundamental commissions. This changed into uncommon, as most apprentices spent years on menial responsibilities earlier than being depended on with whatever music that could be visible by means of the public. However, Leonardo's expertise became too apparent to waste on grinding pigments and cleansing brushes. The turning point came with a fee for the baptism of Christ, supposed for the monastery of San. Designed the composition and painted most of the figures, however, he allowed Leonardo to make a contribution an angel in the decreased left corner of the portrait. Music, while the paintings turned into completed, that unmarried angel found out a stage of artistic success that handed even the grasp's personal paintings. The determined possessed a grace, a mental depth, music, and a technical perfection that introduced the appearance of a brand new sort of artist. Music legend has it that after noticed what his apprentice had finished, he put music down his brushes and by no means painted once more, recognizing that he had been handed by means of his pupil. While this tale is probably apocryphal, music it captures something real, approximately the relationship among master and pupil. Leonardo was now not actually gaining knowledge of techniques. He became transcending them, developing processes to art that would revolutionize painting for hundreds of years to return. By means of 1472, at the age of 20, Leonardo had been regular into the Painters' Guild of Florence. This changed into a huge success, marking his transition from apprentice to impartial master. He was now qualified to take music, commissions, establish his very own workshop, and train apprentices of his own. Most younger artists at this degree could have installation keep, and all started the steady paintings of constructing a popularity and a clientele. Leonardo, however, was already showing signs of the restless genius that would outline his whole career. He seemed incapable of viewing art as really a career to be mastered and exploited. As an alternative music, he noticed it as a way of investigating the innermost mysteries of lifestyles. His notebooks from this period, full of observations approximately mild, shadow, anatomy, and angle, screen of thoughts that refuse to just accept traditional boundaries among different fields of knowledge. The Florence of Leonardo's children was the precise surroundings for such highbrow ambition. Below the patronage of the own family, music, the town had come to be the epicenter of humanist getting to know, in which scholars had been rediscovering music, historic Greek and Roman texts, and attempting to synthesize classical understanding with Christian theology. Artists were not seen as mere craftsmen, however, as highbrow figures able to contributing to humanity's information of itself and the world. This transformation inside the status of artists created new opportunities, but additionally new pressures. Purchasers predicted not simply technical skill, however, evidence of learning, creativity, and intellectual sophistication. Artists were competing not simply with every different, however, with poets, philosophers, and scientists for the attention and aid of rich and effective sponsors. On this environment, Leonardo's aggregate of artistic genius and clinical interest made him uniquely precious. Music, but while he mounted himself as one among Florence's maximum promising younger artists, Leonardo was already displaying the characteristics that might each raise and complicate his profession. He had an almost compulsive want to apprehend how things worked, main him to spend sizable quantities of time on research and experimentation that had no instantaneous practical utility. He struggled to finish initiatives, often forsaking artwork once they now not held his hobby or when new challenges captured his attention. These dispositions were already visible music, in his earliest impartial works. The Annunciation, painted round 1472 to 1475, indicates his mastery of attitude and his cautious commentary music, of natural information. However, it also famous an artist greater inquisitive about fixing technical issues than in definitely creating stunning objects. Every detail of the portrait appears to were approached as a separate undertaking to be overcome through take a look at music and experimentation. As Leonardo moved via his 20s, his recognition in Florence persevered to grow. Music, however, so did his recognition for eccentricity and unreliability. Customers wanted his genius, but additionally they wanted completed works added on schedule. Leonardo wanted to push the limits of what artwork may want to achieve, music to apply portray as a method of scientific investigation and philosophical reflection. These conflicting desires might create a pattern that might repeat throughout his life, main to some of the finest masterpieces ever created, music, however also to a string of abandoned initiatives and annoyed customers. The stage became set for a career in contrast to another in music, the history of art. A journey that might take Leonardo from the workshops of Florence to the courts of Milan, France, and Rome, continually trying to find the right synthesis of artwork, science, and human knowledge that seemed to hover just past music, his hold close. The 12 months 1476 would prove to be a watershed moment in Leonardo's younger existence, even though now not for music, reasons each person would possibly have predicted. Florence, for all its inventive brilliance and intellectual ferment, became also a town music, where popularity might be destroyed in a single day with the aid of whispered accusations and political. It was in this surroundings of creativity and paranoia that Leonardo discovered himself facing Price's music that might have ended maximum careers before they definitely begun. The accusation music becomes sodomy, a crime that carried intense penalties in Renaissance Florence, inclusive of public humiliation, heavy fines, or even exile music, or death. A nameless denunciation were dropped into one of the music, the wooden containers positioned at some stage in the metropolis where residents should file suspected crimes without revealing their identities. Together with Leonardo, numerous other younger guys have been named music, such as members of prominent Florentine households. The costs have been nearly sincerely politically inspired, a part of the complicated net of rivalries and vendettas that characterized Florentine society. For months, Leonardo lived underneath this shadow, his profession and recognition hanging within the stability. The felony complaints dragged on with agonizing slowness. And during this time, he observed it tough to relax new commissions or preserve his position in Florentine society. The experience marked him profoundly, instilling a weariness of public publicity and a choice for the protection music, of powerful purchasers that could symbolize the relaxation of his existence. Ultimately music, the fees had been dropped for loss of evidence. However, the harm to Leonardo's sense of safety changed into everlasting. He became extra guarded, extra careful approximately his associations, and extra dependent on the goodwill of people who may want to shield him from his enemies. This disaster music additionally deepened his natural tendency closer to secrecy and coded, leading him to expand the replicate. Writing that would make music, his notebooks so difficult for others to examine. The aftermath of this ordeal coincided with a shift in Leonardo's creative development that might set up him as one of the most revolutionary painters of his technology. Around 1478, he acquired a commission that might become certainly one of his most essential early works, the Adoration of the Magi music for the monastery of. This painting, although in no way finished, reveals the full emergence of Leonardo's innovative technique music to composition and mental depth, where traditional remedies of this issue arranged figures in static hierarchical compositions. Leonardo created a dynamic spiral of motion that drew the viewer's eye closer to the primary figures of Mary and the infant music, Christ. Each gesture, every expression, each detail of gown and placing become calculated to make a contribution to the overall emotional impact music of the scene. The painting became conceived not simply as a religious picture, but as a mental drama that would have interaction visitors on more than one tiers. The preparatory drawings for the Adoration reveal the incredible intensity of Leonardo's research and planning. He studied horses in motion to best the rearing steeds in the historical past, analyzed facial expressions to capture the range of human responses to divine revelation, and explored architectural factors that could create the proper experience of area and grandeur. Music, every issue of the painting became an possibility for medical investigation and creative innovation. However, as with so lots of Leonardo's initiatives, the Adoration was destined music to remain unfinished. As he worked on the complex composition, new demanding situations and opportunities started out to tug his interest in different guidelines. His notebooks from this era screen a mind that became increasing beyond the bounds of portrait music, to encompass engineering, anatomy, arithmetic, and natural philosophy. He becoming less a painter who dabbled in different subjects, and more a everyday genius for whom painting turned into simply one way of understanding the arena. This highbrow restlessness became both Leonardo's greatest strength and his most critical weak spot. At the same time as other artists centered on perfecting their craft music, within set-up traditions, Leonardo was continuously pushing into uncharted territory, growing new techniques and asking questions that had never been asked before. The consequences have been often breathtaking, but the process became slow, pricey music, and frequently irritating for customers who truly desired finished works. The political state of affairs in Florence throughout the late 1470s and early 1480s additionally created surroundings that turned into an increasing number of uncomfortable for a person of Leonardo's temperament. The Patsy Conspiracy of 1478, wherein members of a rival banking circle of relatives attempted to assassinate at some point of mass on the cathedral, had left the city on facet. The failed plot led to brutal reprisals, with conspirators hanged from the home windows of and their supporters hunted down music all through the city. Leonardo witnessed firsthand the savage realities of Florentine politics when he became commissioned to color portraits of the finished conspirators at the outside walls of the Bargello jail. Those pics, designed to serve as warnings to future plotters, required him to take a look at the faces of useless men music and seize their likenesses in a way that would both pick out them and reveal music, the outcomes of treason. The work was, but it additionally supplied Leonardo with opportunities to observe human anatomy and facial structure that could show useful in his later artistic development. The experience music of painting the dead conspirators appears to have crystallized Leonardo's growing disenchantment with Florence. The town that had nurtured his genius changed into also a music vicinity of violence, suspicion, and petty rivalries that increasingly regarded to constrain in place of encourage his work. He started out to appearance beyond the partitions of Florence, imagining possibilities that could exist in different courts, music, other towns, different facilities of energy and learning. It turned into all through this period of restlessness and looking music that Leonardo began to develop the personality that might define his later career. He cultivated a picture of himself as greater than simply an artist, supplying himself as a master of a couple of disciplines who ought to serve purchasers' music no longer just as a painter, but as an engineer, inventor, military advisor, and court entertainer. Music, this became a radical departure from conventional inventive exercise, where painters were predicted to remain within surely defined expert obstacles. The transformation of Leonardo from a skilled young painter right into a Renaissance polymath turned into sluggish, however decisive. His notebooks from the early 1480s show him grappling with issues of hydraulic engineering, music, analyzing the flight of birds, designing mechanical gadgets, and exploring mathematical ideas that had packages far beyond the visual arts. He was developing for himself a brand new form of expert identification, one that might permit him to pursue expertise anywhere it would lead. This evolution became flawlessly timed to coincide with modifications in how Renaissance courts operated and what they expected from the artists and intellectuals they supported. The old model in which painters had been essentially skilled craftsmen who labored on specific commissions was giving manner to a new machine in which artists have been valued as an awful lot for their highbrow, as for his or her technical. Courts wanted figures who ought to decorate their prestige via their very presence. Guys whose popularity for learning and creativity would replicate well on their purchasers. Leonardo understood those converting dynamics higher than maximum of his contemporaries, and he began to position himself therefore. He studied not simply art and engineering, however also song, literature, and herbal philosophy, developing the kind of broad cultural understanding that might make him a precious addition to any state-of-the-art court. He also cultivated the non-public traits that would enchantment to aristocratic customers, developing an beauty of way and verbal exchange that matched music, his physical beauty and highbrow gifts. By way of 1482, Leonardo had made a decision that would form the subsequent phase of his career. Florence, for all its creative achievements, became turning into too small for his increasing ambitions. The town's republican government, even as supportive of the humanities, couldn't offer the form of sustained patronage music that could allow him to pursue his maximum ambitious tasks. What he wanted became an effective prince music, who could offer no longer simply financial help, but additionally access to the sources and personnel important for massive-scale engineering and artistic undertakings. Music, his interest turned to Milan, one of the most powerful and wealthy in northern Italy. The Duke of Milan, called Mauro, turned into building one of the maximum brilliant courts in Europe, attracting students, artists, and inventors from across the continent. Milan became also a middle of army innovation, continuously growing new guns and fortifications to hold its function inside the complicated internet of Italian politics. For someone of Leonardo's pursuits and targets, it appeared like an ideal destination. The letter that Leonardo wrote to searching for employment at the Milan court famous each his strategic intelligence and his expertise of music, what buyers simply desired. Rather than emphasizing his inventive achievements, he supplied himself. In general, as a Navy engineer, music, listing 10 distinct areas wherein he should serve the Duke's army desires, from designing portable bridges to creating new varieties of siege weapons. Simplest on the quid of the letter did he point out, almost as an afterthought, music, that he may also paint. This method confirmed Leonardo's sensible understanding of Renaissance political realities. At the same time as courts favored artistic splendor, what they wanted maximum urgently were practical benefits within the regular warfare for survival and growth that characterized Italian music, politics. Through positioning himself as someone who may want to make contributions to Navy abilities, Leonardo became imparting music, something a ways extra precious than mere decoration. The strategy worked. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, beginning a brand new bankruptcy in his life that would see him broaden from a promising younger artist into one of the maximum celebrated figures of the Renaissance. The move represented more than only an alternate of music, residence. It became a change of identity from a Florentine painter to a global genius whose reputation could, in the end, span continents, music, and centuries. The Milan that Leonardo entered turned into a metropolis inside the midst of its very own transformation. Underneath's rule, music, it changed into turning into one of the maximum sophisticated and cosmopolitan courts in Europe. An area in which highbrow interest music was valued as fairly as political talent or military prowess. It changed into exactly the surroundings that Leonardo had to absolutely broaden his exceptional skills. And the results of this best fit among genius and opportunity music might astonish the sector. World. The Milan of 1482 turned into in contrast to any city Leonardo had ever skilled, in which Florence hummed with the strength of traders and bankers. Milan pulsed with the rhythm of music, absolute electricity. The Sparta court became a glittering machine designed to task strength and sophistication. And Leonardo determined himself at the center of a global wherein artistic achievement served political ambition on a scale he had never imagined. Known as Moro for his dark complexion and foxy nature, became now not yet the respectable Duke of Milan. He ruled as regent for his young nephew. However, anyone understood that real strength rested in his palms. Become a person of significant subculture and similarly substantial ambition, determined to transform Milan right into a rival to Florence and Venice at the same time, as securing his own function towards the numerous enemies who music questioned his right to rule. The court that welcomed Leonardo became a carefully orchestrated spectacle of wealth and getting to know. The large music citadel that served because the Jugal house were transformed from a navy stronghold right into a palace of unheard of luxurious. Its halls have been filled with the best arts, its libraries stocked with uncommon manuscripts, and its chambers designed to affect traveling dignitaries with the refinement music and power of Milan civilization. Leonardo's first years in Milan were a duration of cautious positioning and sluggish recognition. In contrast to Florence, in which his popularity preceded him, Milan required him to prove his really worth music, in surroundings wherein competition became fierce and failure may want to imply not just expert sadness, however real physical hazard. The courtroom became filled with bold men from across Europe, each in search of to advance their fortunes through provider to. And the warfare for patronage and role turned into music. Regulars. The artist Speedy tested his value via a series of smaller commissions that showcased his versatility and innovation. He designed units for court docket entertainments, created photos of court docket girls, and began work on engineering tasks that might beautify Milan's navy talents. Music, every success brought him toward the inner circle of strength, and step by step, commenced to recognize that he had obtained now not simply another talented artist, however a genius whose prolonged ways past conventional categories. The fee that would simply set up Leonardo's reputation in Milan music came in the form of an equestrian monument to his father and the founder of the dynasty. This was to be no everyday statue, music, but a bronze colossus larger than any sculpture created because ancient instances. A monument that could proclaim Milan electricity and sports legitimacy to the music, global. The technical demanding situations, worried in developing the sort of large bronze casting, have been superb music, requiring innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and artistic approach that driven the boundaries of what was considered feasible. Leonardo approached the venture with characteristic, filling pocket book after notebook with research of horses in movement, anatomical analyses, and engineering calculations. He studied the mechanics of music, movements with scientific precision, dissecting useless horses to understand the structure of muscle mass and bones, and watching dwelling animals to capture the essence of energy and grace that the monument could want to convey. Music, the preparatory work was exhaustive, transforming what could have been a traditional commemorative sculpture right into a groundbreaking research of artwork, technology, and engineering. Music, the scale of the task, required Leonardo to master completely new and increase novel strategies. The bronze required for the casting could weigh extra than 70 tons, necessitating the construction music of specialized furnaces and the development of latest techniques for controlling the drift of molten metal. The supporting structure had to be engineered music, with mathematical precision to save you fall apart. Whilst the artistic concept demanded a stage of dynamic motion that had in no way been attempted music, in sculpture of this size, as paintings on the pony advanced, Leonardo's reputation unfolded at some stage in music, Italy and beyond. The mission have become an image of Milan's ambition and technological superiority, with traffic journeying from throughout Europe to witness the creation of what promised to be the eighth music marvel of the world. The clay version, while finally completed, stood almost 24 high music, and become universally acclaimed as a masterpiece of each inventive, imaginative, and prescient and technical success. However, the horse additionally found out the limitations that might plague a lot of Leonardo's finest initiatives. The sheer complexity of the mission intended that development become gradual and costly, requiring sustained aid from over a few years. As political pressures established an army, threats intensified, the assets required for the bronze casting became increasingly more difficult to justify. The 70 tons of bronze that were allocated for the sculpture music have been subsequently redirected to the greater, immediately need of producing cannons for Milan's defense. Music, the fate of the horse, became symbolic of the precarious balance between creative ambition and political fact that characterized Leonardo's whole career in Milan. Even as he loved unprecedented freedom to pursue his pursuits and expand his ideas, he became also dependent on the continuing prefer of a client whose personal position was some distance from comfortable. The state-of-the-art court subculture that nurtured his genius became built on foundations that might shift dramatically with changes in political fortune. At some point of those identical years, Leonardo changed into additionally pursuing the painting commissions that music could establish his recognition because the best artist of his era. The Virgin of the Rocks, painted for the confraternity of the Immaculate Theory, revealed the entire maturation of his revolutionary method to portray. The paintings tested his mastery of the subtle gradation of tones and hues that created a nearly magical sense of depth and surroundings. The painting was in contrast to something music that have been visible before in Italian art, in which traditional secular paintings relied on clean outlines and bright shades to convey their messages. Leonardo created a mysterious twilight world where paperwork emerged from shadow. Via nearly imperceptible music, gradations of light and darkish. The method required an information of optics and atmospheric perspective that went a ways past traditional inventive schooling. Representing a synthesis of clinical observation and creative intuition music that turned into uniquely his very own. The mental depth of the Virgin of the Rocks become equally innovative. Each parent changed into conceived not as a symbolic representation, music, but as a complicated individual with their own indoors lifestyles and emotional truth. The Virgin's defensive gesture music, toward the infant Christ, the angel's knowing smile, and the young John the Baptist's music, gesture of reputation, all contributed to a story that opened up through diffused visible cues instead of obvious symbolic devices. This method to portray a psychological drama could attain its remaining expression in the work that many remember Leonardo's greatest achievement, The Ultimate Supper. Commissioned for the Convent of Maria, this fresco meant to function a devotional picture for the Dominican friars, who amassed music there for their food. What Leonardo created rather became a progressive exploration of human psychology under intense pressure. A work that transformed a familiar spiritual difficulty right into a timeless meditation on betrayal, loyalty, and the complexity of human nature. The technical improvements required for the Last Supper have been as groundbreaking music as its inventive thought. Conventional fresco technique required artists to paintings fast music, while the plaster became still moist, making plans and special execution hard. Leonardo instead evolved an experimental method that music allowed him to paintings more slowly and deliberately, constructing up layers of paint music with the precision and subtlety that his vision required. The composition itself became a masterpiece of mathematical precision and psychological perception. The apostles had been organized in 4 corporations of 3, each group representing a music, special emotional response to Christ's assertion that considered one of them might betray him. The angle lines all converged on Christ's head, developing a visual focus that bolstered the narrative centrality of his announcement. Whilst the various reactions of the disciples discovered music, the entire spectrum of human reaction to disaster and revelation, every detail of the portrait was calculated to make a contribution to its universal impact. The positioning of palms, the direction of gazes, the association of drapery, music, and the position of objects on the desk all served to manual the viewer's attention and enhance the dramatic anxiety music of the scene. The end result turned into a piece that functioned concurrently as spiritual art, psychological drama, and technical excursion pressure. Leonardo because the preeminent painter of his age. However, whilst Leonardo became creating these masterpieces, his restless intelligence became pulling him in new instructions that might ultimately outline his legacy as tons as his artistic achievements. His notebooks from the Milan length display a thoughts that was systematically investigating each factor of the natural world. From the flight of birds to the float of water, music, from human anatomy to mechanical engineering, from optics to acoustics, the court docket have supplied the proper environment for this highbrow music, growth. In contrast to the commercial workshops of Florence, in which time was cash and efficiency become paramount, music, the Milan court valued gaining knowledge of for its personal sake and changed into willing to assist investigations that had no instantaneous sensible application. Leonardo became capable of pursue questions genuinely because they involved him, growing a frame of medical remark and theoretical speculation that would now not be equaled for hundreds of years. His anatomical studies during this period had been music, specifically groundbreaking. Running with physicians at nearby hospitals, Leonardo completed dissections on human corpses, growing certain drawings that revealed the structure and feature of inner organs with remarkable accuracy. These research went far beyond the wishes of creative representation. Music, representing actual medical research that superior human expertise of physiology and anatomy. The mechanical innovations that crammed his notebooks at some stage in those years have been equally outstanding. Leonardo designed flying machines primarily based on his observations of bird flight, army engines that might revolutionize siege war, and hydraulic systems that would transform agriculture music and concrete planning. While lots of those designs were too advanced for the generation of his time, they an information of mechanical standards that could not be absolutely liked till the modern-day era. This explosion of innovative and highbrow hobby music mounted Leonardo as some distance greater than just an artist inside the eyes of his contemporaries. He became an image of human ability itself, a determined who regarded to embody the Renaissance belief that character genius may want to transcend traditional boundaries and obtain something. Drawing close divine information. Music, the courtroom of Milan underneath his influence have become a middle of innovation, and gaining knowledge of that attracted pupils and artists from throughout Europe. Yet while Leonardo reached the peak of his powers and impact, the political foundations of his fulfillment were starting to disintegrate. The complex net of alliances that maintained the stability of electricity in Italy changed into moving, and the French had been beginning to cast covetous eyes on the rich Italian. For all his cultural achievements and political cunning, changed into approximately to face demanding situations that might test no longer simplest his rule, however the whole world that had nurtured Leonardo's genius. The year 1499 could bring catastrophic trade to Milan music, and with it, the cease of the most efficient and solid length of Leonardo's profession. The grasp who had regarded to locate his best environment was approximately to discover that within the international of Renaissance politics, even genius provided no safety music against the brutal realities of electricity and ambition. The golden age of the Milan courtroom became drawing to a close, and Leonardo would quickly find himself over again on the lookout for a customer who may want to provide both protection and the freedom to pursue the endless questions that drove his terrific thoughts. Music, the typhoon that would destroy Leonardo's Milan paradise, had been gathering for years. However few its glittering court music had paid interest to the dark clouds massing beyond the Alps. The French King Charles VII had already established his urge for food for Italian conquest music for the duration of his invasion of 1494, and his successor Louis harbored even greater aims. When ascended to the French throne in 1498, he straightway began pressing his declare to the Duchy of Milan, arguing that his grandmother's marriage to a duke gave him legitimate rights to the territory that had usurped. For Leonardo, absorbed in his medical investigations and creative initiatives, the approaching disaster must have regarded like thunder, ominous, however no longer right away threatening. Music he had spent 17 years constructing his popularity and function in Milan, creating a lifestyle that allowed him unheard of freedom to pursue his diverse pastimes. The court had ended up now not simply his administrative center, but his highbrow domestic, a surroundings in which his stressed curiosity become valued and supported in preference to visible as an inconvenient distraction music from more realistic issues. The signs and symptoms of coming near catastrophe had been everywhere music for those inclined to look them. His political maneuvering had become increasingly determined as he sought allies towards the French threat, even as concurrently looking to maintain his precarious preserve on electricity within Milan itself. His nephew, the rightful duke, had died below suspicious circumstances music in 1494, allowing to assume the ducal identify formally. However, this flow had most effective intensified the questions about his legitimacy and created new enemies each. Inside and outside music, the Leonardo's fantastic bronze horse, that symbol of Milan electricity and sports activities legitimacy, had emerged as an increasingly painful reminder of unfulfilled guarantees. The clay model nonetheless stood in its workshop, a marvelous testament to inventive and engineering fulfillment, but the bronze that must have given it everlasting form had long considering that been melted down for cannons. The pony had become a metaphor music for the court itself, amazing in concept, but in the long run at risk of the cruel realities of political and army necessity. The disintegrate, while it music got here, became fast and devastating. In September 1499, French forces crossed the Alps and advanced on Milan with music, an performance that greatly surprised the Italian political established order. His carefully constructed alliances crumbled as former allies either music, fled or switched aspects, leaving him isolated and defenseless. The Duke, who had as soon as commanded one of the most effective courts in Europe, located himself deserted through all however his most unswerving fans, going through an enemy whose navy superiority changed into overwhelming. On October 6, music 1499, King Louis XII entered Milan in triumph, ending almost a century of rule. The marvelous courtroom that had been Leonardo's global for 17 years truly ceased to exist in a single day. Courtiers scattered to discover new customers. Music, servants fled with something valuables they might carry, and the extremely good palace that had been the middle of Milan cultural existence emptied, as if struck by plague. Leonardo confronted a crisis that went music a long way beyond the loss of employment. At 47 years antique, he was now not a promising younger artist who could effortlessly discover new possibilities. His reputation became considerable, however it was additionally complicated and once in a while troubling to potential customers. He was called lots for his unfinished tasks as for his finished masterpieces, music, and his medical hobbies. While captivating, regularly regarded to distract him from the sensible duties that rulers needed done. The on-the-spot music threat changed into even more urgent than the long-term task of locating new patronage. The French profession turned into followed by means of significant looting and destruction music, as soldiers and camp followers seized whatever they might find. Leonardo's workshop filled with years of amassed drawings, models, music, and experimental apparatus become especially prone. The notable clay model of the pony became a goal for French archers' music, who used it for target practice until it became reduced to fragments, destroying for all-time music. One of the maximum bold, creative initiatives of the Renaissance. Within the chaos of those very last weeks in music, Milan, Leonardo managed to salvage what he could of his lifestyle's paintings. He accumulated his maximum treasured notebooks, rolled up his drawings, and prepared for some other exile that might take music, him back into the unsure world of seeking patronage and protection. The mathematical calculations, anatomical research, and engineering designs music that filled his notebooks represented decades of research and discovery. Highbrow treasures that had been irreplaceable music and infinitely transportable. The adventure south from Milan in past due 1499 music need to were packed with uncertainty and regrets. Leonardo became observed through his longtime associate, music, a young man of doubtful recognition, however simple beauty, who had entered his household as a boy music, and remained no matter a talent for theft and mischief that had earned him his nickname, which intended Little Devil. Additionally, traveling with them became the terrific mathematician whose paintings on percentage and geometry had deeply influenced Leonardo's considering artwork and science. Their destination, music, was Venice, wherein Leonardo was hopping to find transient safe haven and possibly new opportunities. The Venetian Republic, with its commercial empire and subculture of hearing, overseas professionals for army and engineering projects, appeared like a logical area for someone of his talents to locate employment. Venice became additionally one of the few Italian states with both the assets and the music independence important to resist French enlargement, making it a herbal haven for refugees from French-occupied territories. The Venice that welcomed Leonardo in December 1499 was a town unlike some other in Europe. A maritime empire constructed on change and maintained through a mixture of diplomatic music, foxy, and naval energy. The Venetians had created a unique shape of presidency that balanced aristocratic privilege with republican institutions, producing a balance that had continued for centuries, even as other Italian states rose and fell with bewildering frequency. However, Venice also provided Leonardo with challenges that he had no longer predicted. The town's pragmatic service provider way of life turned into much less inquisitive about natural intellectual hypothesis than the courtly surroundings he had left behind in Milan. Venetian customers wanted results that might beautify their business or army benefits, music, and they had been much less willing to assist the type of open-ended research that had flourished under his patronage. The fee that the Venetian Senate offered Leonardo contemplated these practical priorities. They desired him to lay out shielding systems that could shield their territories at the Italian mainland from the advancing French forces. This changed into music, exactly the sort of Navy engineering paintings that Leonardo had promised in his letter to 2 decades in advance. However, the unique demanding situations posed by way of the Venetian situation music required completely new procedures to the problems of fortification and defense. Leonardo's response became characteristically revolutionary and bold. In preference to in reality strengthening current fortifications, he proposed a thorough answer that might use the natural geography of the vicinity to create an impregnable barrier against invasion. His plan referred to as for the development of a series of dams and canals that might permit the Venetians to flood the entire valley, growing an impassable water barrier between French forces and Venetian territory. The engineering demanding situations involved in any such task had been astounding, requiring precise calculations about water drift, soil composition, music, and structural engineering that driven the limits of modern understanding. Leonardo threw himself into the work with function intensity, producing distinct drawings and mathematical analyses that demonstrated both the feasibility and the potential effectiveness of his concept. However, even as he worked on these navy tasks, Leonardo's stressed thoughts became exploring different opportunities that Venice might provide. The metropolis's role as a middle of global trade intended that it was continuously exposed to new ideas and technology from across the regarded global. The Venetian arsenal, wherein the Republic's robust fleet was constructed and maintained, represented one of the maximum superior centers of business manufacturing in Europe. A place in which conventional craftsmanship became being transformed by way of new methods of corporation and mechanization. Leonardo's notebooks from his Venetian duration screen his fascination with these commercial improvements. He studied the rope-making machines, the standardized production techniques, and the coordinated workflow that allowed the arsenal to construct ships with extraordinary velocity and performance. These observations would later have an effect on his thinking about mechanical design and commercial enterprise, contributing to innovations and theories that were centuries beforehand of their time. The medical possibilities that Venice supplied have been similarly compelling. The metropolis's physicians and herbal philosophers had access to clinical information from throughout the Mediterranean International, which include translations of Arabic texts that preserved and extended ancient Greek mastering. Leonardo's anatomical research, which were interrupted via his hasty departure from Milan, could be resumed with get right of entry to new sources of facts and possibly new possibilities for dissection and remark. Yet, regardless of these intellectual attractions, Leonardo's stay in Venice would prove to be quick and in the long run unsatisfying. The Republic's authorities, for all its stability and prosperity, operated in keeping with methods and priorities that left little room for the sort of person genius that Leonardo represented. Decisions were made by committees. Tasks had been evaluated in line with immediate practical advantages, and the form of long-term speculative research that Leonardo valued was difficult to justify in the Venetian machine. The flooding project, in spite of its technical brilliance, changed into ultimately rejected by using the Senate as too luxurious and too volatile. Venetian army engineers, at the same time as acknowledging the innovation of Leonardo's method, have been skeptical about its practicality and involved about the capability for accidental consequences that might damage Venetian territories as a whole lot as they included them. The Republic's traditional reliance on naval strength and diplomatic maneuvering regarded greater reliable than radical new schemes that would or would possibly. Now not paintings as supposed. By way of the spring of 1500, Leonardo changed into already looking past Venice for new opportunities. Letters and rumors from throughout Italy brought information of ability consumers' and promising situations that would provide the mixture of economic guide and intellectual freedom that he required. The French career of Milan had disrupted the entire Italian political machine, growing both dangers and opportunities as various powers struggled to conform to the new reality. One possibility that seemed especially promising became a go back to Florence, the town where Leonardo's profession had started nearly 30 years earlier. The Florentine Republic had lately passed through its very own political transformation, overthrowing the Medici and establishing a new authorities that claimed to represent the will of the human beings. This Republican regime turned into actively in search of to enhance its status and display its cultural sophistication, by way of attracting prominent artists' music and intellectuals who ought to contribute to a new flowering of Florentine achievements. Music, the possibility of returning domestic, held each points of interest and complications for Leonardo. Florence represented the roots music, of his creative improvement, and the region where he had first learned to look himself as more than just a craftsman. However, it changed into additionally the city where he had faced prison problems and social obstacles that had, in the long run, pushed him toward trying to find his fortune some other place. The question of whether the brand new Florentine government might welcome him warmly or view him with suspicion remained music, to be responded. As spring turned to summer in 1500, Leonardo made the decision to leave Venice and return to Florence, starting some other bankruptcy in a lifestyles that regarded destined to be marked via constant motion and version. The exceptional artist who had as soon as regarded to have found his perfect domestic in Milan turned into another time in search of a purchaser and an area in which his tremendous abilities should flourish. The road ahead would lead via acquainted territories, transformed via warfare, and political upheaval music closer to a city that promised each homecoming and new challenges in equal measure. The Florence that Leonardo entered in April 1500 became dramatically different from the metropolis he had left 18 years earlier. The confident service provider republic of his youth had been replaced via an extra austere and unsure nation, one which had experienced the trauma of foreign invasion, inner revolution, and religious upheaval. The amazing court docket lifestyle that had flourished beneath music changed into gone. Changed by means of a more sober republican government that regarded creative luxurious with suspicion at the same time as still spotting the fee of cultural prestige. The modifications went some distance beyond politics to touch each element of Florentine existence. Music, the brief but intense impact of the Dominican who had dominated the town music, all through the 1490s had left lasting marks on Florentine tradition and music, consciousness. His condemnation of worldly vanity music and his calls for ethical purification had brought about the famous bonfires of the vanities, wherein residents had voluntarily destroyed artwork, books, cosmetics, and other gadgets deemed spiritually dangerous. Even though himself had been finished in music, 1498, his influence lingered within the form of a greater austere public way of life that turned into suspicious of the form of courtly elegance that had the era. The brand new Florentine government, led by using the Republican politician, became committed to democratic ideas and civic virtue. However, it also diagnosed that cultural success should decorate the Republic's recognition and appeal to the help of music, powerful allies. For Leonardo, this new Florence presented both possibilities and challenges that required cautious navigation. His reputation as one of the best artists of the age preceded him. However, so did his association with the sort of courtly tradition that the Republic had rejected. The question of the way to roll himself within this converted political and cultural landscape might require all of his vast diplomatic and adaptableness. The fee that could outline Leonardo's 2D Florentine period got here from a surprising source. The friars of the searching for a prestigious for their church had initially gotten smaller with Filipino Lippi for a painting of the Virgin and Baby with Saint Anne. Once they discovered that Leonardo had returned to Florence, they approached him with a suggestion that he determined not possible to refuse, not least due to the fact it came with housing and guide for his whole family. Leonardo's response to this fee could demonstrate both his persisted creative evolution music and his developing popularity as a discern whose very presence better the status of his shoppers. Rather than surely turning in a conventional religious painting, he created a cartoon, a complete-scale preparatory drawing that became a sensation music in its own right. The paintings depicted the Virgin Mary seated on the lap of her mom, and with the infant Christ reaching towards a lamb held by means of the young John the Baptist. The mental complexity and technical innovation of this cartoon had been at once identified by means of cutting-edge viewers. The interweaving of the four figures' music created a composition of remarkable dynamism and emotional depth. Whilst Leonardo's mastery created a nearly supernatural feel of atmosphere and extent, when the cartoon changed into displayed publicly, it drew crowds of admirers who got here not just to see a stunning drawing, however to witness what regarded like a brand new shape of inventive achievements. The general public reaction to the Saint Anne Cool animated film found out something important about Leonardo's evolving popularity. He turned into no longer visible merely as a skilled painter, or at the same time as a court docket artist. Music, but as a kind of cultural phenomenon whose paintings transcended traditional classes. Human beings got here to see his drawings and paintings the way they music, might visit a surprise of nature or a sacred relic in search of an experience. That went past aesthetic appreciation to approach something music, like religious revelation. This elevation of artistic popularity added Leonardo new kinds of opportunities, music, and responsibilities. The Florentine authorities, spotting his price music as a cultural ambassador, started out to recall him for projects that might beautify the Republic's prestige and demonstrate its commitment to inventive excellence. The most ambitious of these tasks would prove to be one of the finest, demanding situations of Leonardo's career, music, checking out no longer most effective his artistic, but additionally his capacity to paintings in the constraints music of Republican politics and public responsibility. The fee that could devour Leonardo's energies and challenge his popularity for the following numerous years got here in music, the form of a direct challenge from the Florentine government. The Republic's new leaders, keen to illustrate their cultural sophistication while additionally putting forward their authority over the metropolis's creative community, determined to fee a large fresco for the partitions of the newly built music. This turned into to be no everyday civic decoration, but a celebration of Florentine army prowess music that could rival the finest inventive achievements of antiquity. The concern chosen for Leonardo's fresco changed into the war of a Florentine victory over Milan forces in 1440 that had secured the Republic's independence and tested the superiority of citizen soldiers over mercenary armies. The irony of asking Leonardo, music, who had spent 17 years serving Milan, to have fun a Florentine overcome his former consumers, was not lost on everybody concerned. But it additionally represented a kind of homecoming ritual, a public demonstration that the artist's loyalties now lay together with his native town. The dimensions of the mission became surprising. The wall designated for the fresco measured nearly 60 feet in period and 20 in height, creating a surface area that dwarfed something Leonardo had previously tried. The technical, demanding situations were equally ambitious, requiring him to expand new techniques for transferring his layout to the music wall at the same time as preserving the precision and subtlety that had become his artistic signature. Leonardo approached the assignment with function, music, and innovation. His preparatory research display an artist grappling now not just with the logistics of painting, however with fundamental questions music, about how artwork ought to seize the truth of conflict and violence. In preference to creating a conventional party of army glory, he appeared music, decided to discover the psychological and bodily trauma of combat. The instant when civilized humans descended into animal brutality. The principal scene of the composition centered on the battle for a conflict preferred with established warriors locked in desperate fight, whilst their horses reared and bit at each different music, with almost human fury. Leonardo's studies of anatomy, developed in the course of his paintings at the monument, now observed new software music, as he sought to deliver the fear and confusion of war via the moves of each men and animals. But the war of might additionally become to Leonardo's ongoing struggles with the practical needs of huge-scale artistic production. His experimental approach to fresco method, designed to permit for the subtle gradations of music, tone, and that his imaginative and prescient required proved tricky while carried out to such a considerable surface. The paint began to go to pot almost at once. Music forcing him to desert sections of the work and test with distinct procedures that would show extra long-lasting. The frustrations of operating on the warfare have been compounded by way of the presence of every other creative genius who'd been commissioned to paint the other wall of the equal music chamber. Michelangelo, 23 years more youthful than Leonardo music, and already identified as a sculptor of outstanding capacity, were assigned the venture of depicting the struggle of any other Florentine military victory. The arrangement created an exceptional music-creative rivalry that captured the creativeness of the entire town. The comparison between the two artists could hardly ever have been greater dramatic. Where Leonardo becomes stylish, music-courtly, and diplomatic, Michelangelo turned into hard, passionate, and fiercely unbiased. Where Leonardo's technique to art emphasized medical observation and technical innovation, Michelangelo trusted uncooked emotional energy and an almost mystical knowledge of human anatomy. Their different temperaments and techniques represented competing visions of what Renaissance artwork ought to reap. The opposition among Leonardo and Michelangelo became one of the great spectacles of music, Renaissance Florence. Citizens would go to look at both artists at paintings, comparing their techniques and debating the relative merits in their procedures. The rivalry pushed each man to their limits, forcing them to justify their strategies and exhibit their capabilities earlier than the maximum stressful target audience conceivable, their fellow artists and the sophisticated music, residents of Florence. For Leonardo, the strain of this very public competition became complex via his developing attention that his creative hobbies had been diverging from the expectancies of his buyers' music and public. At the same time as Florence wanted him to finish the battle of and set up his recognition because the city's preeminent music painter, his own highbrow interest became pulling him in the direction of medical investigations that seemed an increasing number of incompatible with the demands of music, artistic production. His notebooks from this era display a thoughts that was systematically music, exploring every issue of the herbal global with in depth that on obsession. His anatomical studies, resumed with the cooperation of Florentine physicians, have been producing insights into human physiology that music went a ways beyond anything required for artistic purposes. He turned into dissecting corpses not to improve his capability to color human figures, however to apprehend the essential procedures of life itself. The flying machines that filled page after web page of his notebooks represented every other area where Leonardo's investigations had moved past sensible application in the direction of pure clinical speculation. His observations of chicken flight conducted with mathematical precision and recorded with obsessive detail had been producing theoretical insights approximately aerodynamics music and mechanical flight that could now not be completely understood for any other 4 centuries. These scientific hobbies were no longer merely highbrow exercises for Leonardo, however part of a larger philosophical venture that sought to apprehend the essential ideas underlying all herbal phenomena. He was growing a worldview that saw connections and styles anywhere from the branching of bushes to the float of blood, through veins from the movement of water to the structure of mountains. Art for him was becoming just one way of investigating those widespread music ideas. The tension among Leonardo's increasing medical hobbies and his responsibilities as an artist music created a disaster that might outline the remainder of his profession. The war remained unfinished. Its deteriorating surface a keen reminder of the music gap between inventive ambition and sensible achievements. Michelangelo, meanwhile, had abandoned his own fresco to just accept a commission for the chapel ceiling, leaving both partitions of the palazzo chamber music incomplete. The failure to finish the conflict of broken Leonardo's reputation in Florence and raised questions about his reliability that could comply with him for the rest of his profession. Critics began to signify that his medical hobbies had compromised his artistic music, that his pursuit of universal understanding had made him incapable of focusing on the precise tasks that shoppers required. The photo of Leonardo as an exceptional, however unreliable genius, charming to take a look at however dangerous to hire, started to take form. But whilst his standing in Florence snorts have become increasingly more precarious, Leonardo's popularity someplace else become achieving new heights. His notebook's music had been circulating among scholars and intellectuals across Europe, setting up him as one of the leading herbal philosophers of his age. His anatomical drawings had been being studied by using physicians who diagnosed their scientific value, while his engineering designs have been being examined with the aid of Navy specialists who understood their innovative implications. The portrait that he painted throughout these Florentine years might become perhaps his most well-known paintings, even though few at the time ought to have anticipated its eventual significance. The subject became Lisa, the wife of a wealthy Florentine silk service provider named. The commission itself changed into surprisingly modest, a portrait supposed for the circle of relatives' personal collection in preference to public show. What Leonardo created, however, music, transcended the traditional limitations of portrait painting to become something unheard of in Western art. The woman who had come to be to history as the Mona Lisa embodied all of Leonardo's theoretical insights, approximately human psychology, optical science, and artistic method. Her enigmatic expression created through the subtle software of regarded to trade depending on the viewer's attitude and emotional kingdom. The technical improvements seen inside the Mona Lisa represented the culmination of music, a long time of clinical investigation translated into creative practice. Leonardo's knowledge of atmospheric attitude evolved through cautious observation of ways distance, influences the appearance of objects allowed him to create a landscape heritage music of extraordinary depth and realism. His understanding of human anatomy informed everything of the determines creation, from the delicate modeling of fingers to the proper rendering of facial features. But the Mona Lisa was additionally considerable for what it discovered approximately Leonardo's changing dating together with his patrons and his artwork. Not like his in-advance works which had been created for precise religious or political purposes, this portrait appeared music, to exist typically as an possibility for Leonardo to explore his very own creative and medical hobbies. He worked on it slowly and obsessively, carrying it with him as he traveled and continuing to refine info lengthy after any affordable purchaser music would have taken into consideration it entire. The portrait became a type of laboratory for Leonardo's investigations into the nature of human notion and emotion. He became fascinated by the task of capturing music, no longer simply physical appearance but psychological depth. The inner life that animated the external shape. The subtle gradations of mild and shadow that performed across the problem's face were designed to signify the complexity of human attention itself. As Leonardo's popularity for unreliability grew, so did his fee as a cultural image. Powerful customers across Europe started to compete for his services, no longer due to the fact they anticipated him to finish particular tasks on schedule, but due to the fact his presence at their courts would beautify their status music and reveal their sophistication. He turned into becoming much less an artist who came about to be famous and extra a superstar whose creative sports have been secondary music to his symbolic significance. This variation in Leonardo's status created new opportunities but additionally new pressures. Courts that had invited him as a painter determined themselves web hosting, a natural logician whose pursuits ranged across every conceivable discipline of understanding. His anatomical dissections, his engineering experiments, and his mathematical investigations all required sources and help that went a long way past what traditional artistic patronage supplied. Music, the French, who had located Leonardo's genius at some stage in their profession of Milan, had been especially keen to secure his offerings. King Louis XII, having consolidated his manage over northern Italy, changed into looking for approaches to show that French rule may want to help the equal kind of cultural success that had made the Italian courts well known throughout Europe. Leonardo represented music, exactly the sort of prestigious acquisition that might validate French claims to cultural as well as political supremacy. The invitation that might eventually draw Leonardo away from Florence came from the French governor of music, Milan, and a man who understood each the realistic and symbolic value of genius. Offered now not just employment, however, a return to the type of environment in which Leonardo's diverse pastimes music could flourish without the constraints imposed through republican politics or industrial considerations. By way of 1506, Leonardo had made his choice. Florence, the city of his start and early education, could now not provide the intellectual freedom and financial assist that his expanding pastimes required. The war of might continued to be all the time unfinished, a sufferer music of the space between artistic ambition and realistic reality. But the medical investigations that had distracted him from its of completion would music show to be his maximum lasting contribution to human information. The go back to Milan in 1506 music marked the start of Leonardo's final section as an artist and scientist. He was 54 years vintage, not the promising young skills who had first arrived at its courtroom, however a determinant of global reputation, music, whose very presence should remodel the cultural landscape of anywhere he selected to settle. The French courtroom that welcomed him back to Milan changed into eager to gain from his genius. However, they have been additionally preparing to find out that genius on Leonardo's scale got here with headaches that no client had yet learned to manage successfully. The Milan that Leonardo backed to in 1506 bore little resemblance to the glittering court docket music he had left 7 years earlier. The French profession had transformed the city from an unbiased middle of power into a provincial capital of an overseas empire. Once the image of Milan independence, music now housed French administrators and military commanders who regarded their Italian topics with an aggregate of appreciation and suspicion. Charles, the French governor who had secured Leonardo's go back, was a cultivated nobleman who understood the propaganda cost of cultural achievements. Via bringing the maximum famous artist in Europe returned to Milan music, below French patronage, he turned into creating a statement about the superiority of French civilization and the advantages that Italian towns ought to count on from accepting French rule. Leonardo's presence music could demonstrate that the brand new regime should help creative and highbrow achievement as efficaciously as the court had completed. For Leonardo, the return to Milan presented a risk to renew the clinical investigations that were interrupted by means of his departure, and to work inside a device that valued innovation and experimentation. The French management, with its emphasis on navy engineering and technological development, was in particular interested in Leonardo's mechanical inventions and his know-how in hydraulic engineering. The initiatives that occupied Leonardo all through his second Milan duration meditated both his matured pastimes and the sensible desires of his French buyers. Music, he became commissioned to lay out a series of canals that could enhance navigation and irrigation music in the course of a huge challenge that required him to survey music, sizable areas of geographical region and broaden new techniques for shifting earth and controlling water glide. Those hydraulic initiatives allowed Leonardo to mix his artistic sensibility with his engineering understanding in ways that produced both practical advantages and aesthetic delight. The canals he designed have been now not merely practical waterways, but cautiously deliberate landscapes that more suitable the splendor of the nation-state, even as serving business and agricultural functions. His notebooks from this era show him considering engineering troubles with the equal interest to proportion and concord that he brought to his paintings. The anatomical research that Leonardo pursued throughout those years represented the fruits of a lifelong fascination music, with the structure and feature of dwelling organisms. Operating with physicians on the hospital of Maria, he became capable of carry out dissections on human corpses with an precision that had never earlier than been attempted. Music, his drawings of the human heart, apprehensive system, and reproductive organs performed a level of accuracy that music could no longer be surpassed for centuries. Those anatomical investigations had been driven through extra-than-scientific curiosity. Leonardo was looking for to apprehend the essential concepts that governed all dwelling things. The hidden mechanisms that linked the microcosm of human body structure with the macrocosm of the natural international. Music, his famous drawing of the man showing the human determine inscribed within a circle and rectangular, represented his notion that human proportions meditated the mathematical standards underlying all of Advent. The medical paintings that Leonardo performed throughout his second length set up him as one of the leading natural philosophers of his age. However, it also created tensions with shoppers who predicted extra-traditional styles of creative production. The French court liked his engineering knowledge and valued his presence as a cultural decoration. However, additionally, they desired artwork, sculptures, and decorative works that could enhance their prestige and display their sophistication. Leonardo's response to these expectations discovered both his inventive evolution and his developing impatience with conventional patronage relationships. The few paintings he completed at some stage in these years, consisting of a 2D model of the Virgin of the Rocks and his haunting depiction of John the Baptist music, confirmed a deepening mental complexity and technical refinement that exceeded even his earlier masterpieces. The John the Baptist especially represented a new path music in Leonardo's artwork, one which emphasized spiritual thriller over traditional spiritual iconography. The saint's androgynous beauty music and enigmatic gesture created an image that was concurrently music, sacred, and profane, difficult viewers to appearance beyond floor appearances, music closer to deeper religious truths. The painting's dark atmospheric background music and diffused modeling of form tested Leonardo's mastery of the dramatic interaction of mild and shadow music that could influence generations of later artists. However, at the same time as Leonardo changed into growing those very last masterpieces, his interest music became increasingly focused on theoretical investigations that had little instant software to inventive exercise. His research of optics, music, acoustics, and mechanics had been generating insights that could now not be completely preferred until the medical revolution of the 17th century. He turned into growing theories approximately the nature of mild, the conduct of fluids, and the ideas of mechanical advantage music that positioned him centuries ahead of his contemporaries. The notebooks that Leonardo crammed during his second-length screen, thoughts that was systematically operating in the direction of a unified idea of herbal phenomena. He saw connections anywhere from the spiraling styles of water glide to music, the branching systems of timber and blood vessels. His investigations have been guided with the aid of the perception that the identical mathematical concepts ruled all herbal tactics from the smallest organic functions to the biggest cosmic actions. This holistic approach to information made Leonardo more and more remoted from his contemporaries' music, who had been acquainted with extra-specialized styles of knowledge. Even as other artists targeted on perfecting their craft within music, mounted traditions, and other scientists focused on particular fields of research. Leonardo turned into pursuing a kind of time-honored understanding that regarded to belong to an earlier age of philosophical hypothesis. The isolation became highbrow in addition to social. Leonardo's habit of writing in mirror script and his use of coded symbols made his notebooks difficult for others to examine. At the same time as his tendency to depart tasks unfinished created a recognition for unreliability that limited his possibilities for collaboration. He becoming a solitary genius favorite from a distance, however difficult to work with on realistic projects. The political state of affairs in Italy for the duration of the early 16th century also contributed to Leonardo's feel of displacement and uncertainty. The French occupation of Milan turned into constantly threatened by means of transferring alliances and army campaigns that could exchange the balance of power overnight. The papal states, the Holy Roman Empire and various Italian have been all maneuvering for gain, creating an environment of perpetual instability that made long-time period planning tough. In 1512, these political tensions finally erupted into open struggle that might again disrupt Leonardo's life and profession. A coalition of papal and Spanish forces supported with the aid of Swiss mercenaries, launched a campaign to drive the French out of northern Italy. The conflict of an April 1512 led to a French victory, however at such huge fee that it surely weakened their position and advocated their enemies to preserve the fight. As the navy state of affairs deteriorated, French manipulate over Milan have become increasingly more precarious. Charles, Leonardo's patron and protector, died in 1511, leaving the artist without a dependable advice inside the French management. The new French commanders had been extra focused on instantaneous navy wishes than on cultural achievements, and they had little endurance for the form of lengthy time period medical investigations that absorbed maximum of Leonardo's interest. The end came all of sudden inside the summertime of 1512, whilst French forces were sooner or later driven out of Milan by the mixed armies of their enemies. For the second time in his career, Leonardo discovered himself fleeing from a collapsing political order, compelled to abandon projects and are seeking for shelter elsewhere. At 60 years old, he changed into too skilled to be amazed through such reversals, but too set in his methods to conform easily to new instances. The Milan that Leonardo left in the back of in 1512 became a city that had been converted with the aid of decades of overseas career and struggle. The cultural achievements of the period have been in large part destroyed or dispersed, and the French attempt to recreate that golden age had in the end failed. Leonardo's own contributions to the metropolis's highbrow lifestyles, from his engineering initiatives to his clinical investigations, might be largely forgotten till scholars started to rediscover his notebook's centuries later. As Leonardo traveled south from Milan for what might show to be the very last time, he carried with him the accumulated information and experience of a long time dedicated to information the herbal world. His notebooks contained insights into anatomy, engineering, optics, and mechanics that would now not be equaled for generations, while his artwork represented a stage of inventive fulfillment that had redefined what became feasible in visual artwork. But he turned into additionally wearing the burden of unfulfilled aims and incomplete initiatives that had marked his entire career. The amazing bronze horse remained a pile of clay fragments. The conflict of changed into deteriorating at the wall of the and limitless scientific. Investigations have been interrupted through the sensible demands of survival in an unstable world. The space between Leonardo's vision and his success had grown wider as opposed to narrower as his reputation and duties had extended. The street ahead might lead via the papal states toward Rome, in which a brand new pope with humanist sympathies changed into creating opportunities for artists and pupils who ought to make a contribution to the religious and cultural renewal of the Catholic Church. Pope Julius II Music had already established his commitment to inventive excellence through commissioning Michelangelo, music, to paint the chapel's ceiling and Raphael to enhance the papal apartments. There is probably room in this new creative renaissance for the getting older genius whose recognition still commanded respect in the course of music, Europe. But Leonardo could discover that Rome, for all its creative possibilities and highbrow resources, supplied demanding situations that had been specific from, but no less tough than those he had faced in Milan and Florence. Music, the papal court docket, operated according to its very own complex guidelines and priorities, and the competition for papal prefer become excessive amongst a number of the maximum talented artists and intellectuals of the age. Success in Rome would require now not simply genius, but the type of political sophistication music, and personal international relations that Leonardo had never completely mastered. Tiered Rome in 1513 turned into a metropolis intoxicated through its own magnificence. Below Pope Julius II and his successor Leo X, the everlasting metropolis had come to be the epicenter of a cultural revolution that sought to rival the glories of ancient Rome. The papal court docket attracted the finest artists, architects, and intellectuals of the age, all competing for commissions that would immortalize their names along the sizes and saints. Into this surroundings of music, ambition and creativity got here Leonardo da Vinci. Now 61 years vintage, and carrying the weight of a lifetime's accrued know-how and sadness. The Rome that welcomed Leonardo bore little resemblance to the medieval city of pilgrims and priests. Pope Medici had transformed the Vatican into a Renaissance music palace where classical gaining knowledge of flourished alongside Christian devotion. The Pope himself became a person of state-of-the-art tastes and luxurious habits who famously declared upon his election that God had given him the papacy music to experience. His courtroom became a glittering spectacle of wealth, and getting to know wherein cardinals competed to display there, and artists vied for the respect of contributing to initiatives that might glorify both the church and the name. For Leonardo, this environment provided each terrific opportunities and new forms of frustration. His recognition preceded him to Rome, in which he turned into received as a living legend, whose very presence better the status of the papal music courtroom. Pope Leo X, who had known Leonardo during the Artists in Advance Live in Florence, was keen to add such a prestigious determinant to his circle of cultural advisors and inventive collaborators. The reciting quarters. Supplied for Leonardo in music, the Vatican's palace contemplated his status. He became given spacious rooms with northern exposure ideal for portrait alongside workshops, wherein he could pursue his medical investigations. The papal library, one of the best in Europe, became placed at his disposal, giving him get entry to historic texts and modern-day scholarship music that have been unavailable some other place. For a person of Leonardo's intellectual appetite, music, these resources, represented an unheard-of possibility to synthesize his lifetime of observations with the accrued know-how of centuries. Yet the Roman environment also supplied demanding situations that examined Leonardo's getting old patience music and flexibility. The papal court became ruled by more youthful artists whose energy and ambition reminded all people of Leonardo's personal advancing years. Michelangelo, now 38 and at the peak of his powers, had recently completed the Sistine Chapel ceiling and changed into working on designs for Pope Julius II's tomb. Raphael, still in his 20s but already recognized as a grasp, changed into decorating the papal apartments with fresco that blended classical grace music with Christian symbolism. The presence of those artistic giants created an atmosphere of extreme competition that was both stimulating and hard for Leonardo. Whilst his popularity commanded recognize, His age and his history of unfinished tasks made a few purchasers hesitant to entrust him with essential commissions. The swift execution and reliable, crowning glory that the work of his younger competitors stood in stark assessment to Leonardo's popularity for perfectionist delays and medical digressions. The commission that Pope in the end offered Leonardo meditated both respect for his genius and awareness of his boundaries. As opposed to a first-rate public work that could require years of sustained attempt, music, the Pope asked a series of smaller projects that could show off Leonardo's diverse capabilities while minimizing the risk of embarrassing delays. These included mechanical gadgets for papal entertainments, engineering consultations for Vatican creation tasks, and scientific investigations that might beautify the Church's recognition for mastering and sophistication. Leonardo approached these assignments with function music, but his notebooks from the Roman duration reveal a mind more and more absorbed with the aid of theoretical questions that had little sensible utility. His research of optics led him to research the character of imaginative and prescient. Itself, music, generating theories approximately how the attention approaches records that might not be confirmed till the improvement of present-day neuroscience. His mechanical investigations explored standards of strength conservation music and transformation that predicted discoveries that could not be formalized till the commercial revolution. Music, the anatomical paintings that Leonardo pursued in Rome, represented perhaps the maximum superior scientific research of his whole career. Running with physicians on the papal clinic, music he became able to perform dissections with unheard of systematic precision, growing targeted drawings of internal organs that discovered their shape music, and characteristic with extraordinary accuracy. His research of the human heart specifically established an expertise of cardiac feature that could now not be equaled till the 17th century. Music, these anatomical investigations had been no longer merely clinical exercises for Leonardo, however, part of a larger philosophical undertaking that sought to apprehend the dating among frame and soul, rely and spirit. Music, he became inquisitive about the query of how bodily approaches could generate recognition and emotion, how the material substance of the mind music ought to produce the immaterial phenomena of concept and feeling. His drawings from this era display him mapping the anxious gadget with music, the precision of a current neurologist, whilst simultaneously exploring questions that belonged greater to philosophy than to remedy. The mechanical inventions that filled Leonardo's Roman notebooks had been similarly top-notch for their theoretical sophistication and practical impossibility. He designed flying machines that integrated insights from his many years of analyzing hen flight, but which required substances and energy sources that would not be to be had for centuries. His ideas for automated production gadget-anticipated business techniques that could not be evolved until the modern-day era, music, at the same time as his research of friction and mechanical advantage laid basis music for standards that might later grow to be essential to engineering technological know-how. The distance among Leonardo's theoretical insights and the technological barriers of his age have become an increasing number of apparent for the duration of his Roman years. He may want to envision solutions to troubles that might no longer be solved for centuries. However, he lacked the materials, tools, music, and manufacturing techniques necessary to enforce his thoughts. This frustration, with the restrictions of his ancient moment music, contributed to a growing sense of isolation and melancholy that marked his very last years. The creative works that Leonardo completed at some stage in his Roman length pondered this anxiety among vision and possibility. His painting of John the Baptist, completed round 1515, music, confirmed a discern that seemed to emerge from darkness through subtle gradations of light and shadow that pushed the limits of what paint ought to music acquire on canvas. The saint's enigmatic expression and ambiguous gesture created a photograph that, became each religious and deeply private. A meditation on religion, doubt, and the mysteries of human focus. The technical innovations visible in this past due work represented the end result of Leonardo's lifelong investigation into the physics of light and the psychology of perception. Every brush stroke turned into informed by means of a long time of clinical statement. From his studies of atmospheric perspective to his evaluation of the way facial muscular tissues create expressions, the portrait functioned concurrently. As a piece of artwork music, and as a scientific demonstration, proving that careful observation of natural phenomena ought to produce aesthetic outcomes that transcended conventional inventive classes. But at the same time as Leonardo turned into growing those very last masterpieces, his courting with the papal court docket became turning into an increasing number of strained. The younger artists who ruled Roman cultural lifestyles operated in keeping with different concepts and priorities than those that had fashioned Leonardo's profession. Where he valued research and experimentation, they emphasized productivity and music of entirety. Where he sought to apprehend established ideas, they targeted on particular initiatives' music and immediate outcomes. The conflict of creative generations had become especially obvious in Leonardo's interactions with Michelangelo, music, whose temperament and strategies represented the whole lot that Leonardo located troubling approximately modern-day artistic practice. Michelangelo worked with passionate depth, completing primary projects through sustained attempt music and unwavering focus. His method to art emphasized emotional electricity music over intellectual refinement, spiritual thought over medical evaluation. The two masters represented competing visions of what Renaissance artwork should obtain, and their rivalry have become one of the defining cultural conflicts of the age. Leonardo's notebooks from his Roman years reveal growing frustration with the limitations and expectations of traditional inventive patronage. At 63, he was being asked to compete with men one to his age in a cultural environment that valued velocity and spectacle music over the careful investigation and theoretical sophistication that had continually driven his work. The space between his popularity music and his modern productivity became increasingly tough to ignore, each for music, himself, and for capacity buyers. The clinical investigations that had usually been Leonardo's genuine passion were also becoming difficult to pursue in the papal courtroom. While Pope Leo X actually liked gaining knowledge of and innovation, the practical needs of governing the church left little time or assets for the form of open-ended research that Leonardo required. The anatomical work that involved him was additionally considered with a few suspicion by way of conservative elements within the Vatican, who worried that such certain observe of human corpses may result in materialist conclusions that contradicted Christian doctrine music about the soul's immortality. Those tensions came to a head in 1516 music, while Pope Leo's attention changed into diverted through the developing disaster of the Protestant Reformation. The undertaking posed by means of Martin's theological criticisms required the Church to awareness its sources music, on protecting orthodox doctrine in preference to assisting speculative investigations that would raise uncomfortable questions about the relationship among music, faith, and purpose. The cultural renaissance that had flourished under papal patronage was starting to offer manner to an extra defensive posture that left little room for the kind of highbrow freedom music that Leonardo required. The invitation that could offer Leonardo, along with his final refuge, came from a surprising source. Francis I, the younger king of France who had lately ascended to the throne, become eager to demonstrate music, his cultural sophistication, and to attract prestigious figures who should enhance the respect of the French courtroom. Having heard of Leonardo's genius from French nobles who had encountered him in the course of their Italian campaigns, Francis presented the getting older master music, a position that seemed almost too precise to be real. The phrases of the French kings provide have been pretty generous. Leonardo could accept a secure residence close to the royal palace together with a generous pension that would unfasten him from economic issues music for the remainder of his life. He would don't have any particular obligations past serving because the king's advisor on artistic and medical subjects, and he would be free to pursue something. Investigations fascinated him. For a man who had spent his complete career balancing his intellectual interest music, in opposition to the realistic needs of patronage, this association represented the best synthesis of safety and freedom. The decision to simply accept Francis I's invitation became not tough for Leonardo to make. Rome, for all its inventive opportunities and intellectual resources, had emerged as an environment where his age and his techniques had been increasingly more visible as obstacles as an alternative. Then music belongings. The French court offered now not simply fabric comfort, but the recognize and appreciation that music he had constantly sought from his consumers. At 64, Leonardo turned into ready to leave at the back of the competitive pressures of Italian cultural life, for the more comfortable ecosystem of a court docket that valued him for what he had already finished, music rather than traumatic consistent proof of his continued productivity. The journey from Rome to France in the autumn of 1516 music marks the start of Leonardo's final chapter, a period that might see him identified no longer just as an extraordinary artist, but as a symbol of human highbrow achievement itself. The notebooks and paintings that he carried with him represented the amassed awareness of a lifetime devoted to know-how the Herbal International. Even as the royal patronage that awaited him in France could provide the safety and recognize that had too frequently been missing in his advanced career. The valley that welcomed Leonardo became a panorama of mild splendor that seemed perfectly suited to the contemplative temper of his very last years. The which King Francis provided as his residence, became a cozy manor house surrounded via gardens in which he could stroll and assume without the pressures and distractions that had marked his urban profession. For the primary time in many years, music, Leonardo observed himself in an environment where his highbrow interest music became valued for its personal sake instead of being visible as an impediment to extra-sensible issues. The relationship that evolved between Leonardo and Francis I was in contrast to any that the artist had skilled with previous patrons. Music, the younger king, still in his early 20s, approached the aging grasp music with a combination of reverence and authentic highbrow curiosity that created an environment of mutual recognize and affection. Francis was now not clearly gathering a prestigious ornament for his court, music, however searching for to learn from one of the best minds of the age, and Leonardo answered to this honest interest with a warmth and openness that were rare in his earlier relationships with consumers. As Leonardo settled into his French retirement, he carried with him music, now not just the bodily artifacts of his career, but the accrued weight of a lifetime's unanswered questions music and unfulfilled aims. The brilliant bronze horse that had consumed years of his strength in Milan existed now music, simplest in drawings and recollections. The conflict of that had challenged his talents in Florence remained, unfinished and deteriorating. Infinite scientific investigations have been interrupted through practical necessities, music, leaving theories half of developed and experiments incomplete. Yet, as he arranged his notebooks and artwork in his new home, Leonardo can also survey achievements that had already secured his vicinity in records. The medical observations recorded in his mirror script had superior human know-how music, in approaches that would not be completely appreciated for centuries. The creative techniques he had developed had revolutionized painting music and established new requirements for what visible artwork ought to attain. The engineering principles he had explored had anticipated technological trends that might rework human civilization. The very last years that would provide Leonardo with the peace and protection necessary music to mirror on this brilliant lifetime of success at the same time as continuing to pursue the questions that had constantly driven music, his restless intelligence. In the gardens of the valley, music, surrounded via the affection of a royal court docket that valued genius for its very own sake, the growing old grasp would discover at remaining the ideal balance music, between intellectual freedom and cloth protection that had eluded him at some stage in his outstanding career. Profession. Music, the very last 3 years of Leonardo's existence, opened up with a serenity that were absent from his, in advanced decades of steady movement and uncertainty. On the chateau, he mounted workouts that meditated each his advancing age and his enduring highbrow curiosity. His mornings had been commonly spent inside the gardens in which he would stroll slowly a number of the cautiously tended paths, observing the play of light through leaves and the styles of boom that had fascinated him music, considering that childhood within the hills of. These everyday walks had been now not simply exercising for an growing old body, however continuation of the clinical statement that had defined his technique to knowledge the sector. Even in his final years, Leonardo stuffed pages with sketches of plant structures, music, noting how one-of-a-kind species tailored to their surroundings and the way mathematical ideas governed their boom styles. His notebooks from this era screen a mind that remained as sharp and inquisitive music as ever. Nevertheless, in search of to decode the fundamental laws that connected all herbal phenomena, the connection with King Francis I deepened into something coming near true friendship. A tremendous improvement for a person who had frequently determined himself, isolated with the aid of his very own genius. The younger monarch could visit often, no longer as a purchaser checking on his investment, but as an eager pupil seeking to apprehend the world through Leonardo's fantastic angle. Their conversations ranged throughout every workable concern, from the mechanics of human anatomy to the design of best cities, from the behavior of water to the moves of celestial bodies. Francis became specially inquisitive about Leonardo's engineering ideas, lots of which appear to anticipate technological opportunities that lay a ways within the future. The growing old master might display mechanical principles using easy models constructed in his workshop, displaying how tools' ratios should multiply pressure, and the way well-designed channels could manipulate the glide of water with mathematical precision. These casual instructions represented a completely unique shape of education, as one in all records' best minds shared his accumulated awareness with a ruler who possessed each the intelligence to recognize and the electricity to potentially implement music. Such improvements, the inventive work that Leonardo produced in the course of these very last years, became confined but profound. Music, his right hand, weakened via what modern health workers agree with may additionally were a stroke, should not execute the suitable brush paintings that had characterized his earlier masterpieces. Yet his left hand remained capable, and he adapted his approach to paintings inside those new constraints, growing drawings and paintings that possessed an extraordinary kind of electricity music than his earlier works. The self-photographs from this era display a face marked by age and revel in, with flowing hair and penetrating eyes, that seemed to look beyond the physical world in the direction of deeper truths. Those pics had been no longer exercises in arrogance, but careful research of the way time transforms human capabilities whilst leaving the crucial person of a person intact. Leonardo changed into documenting his personal growing older process with the identical clinical detachment he had added to his anatomical investigations, growing a visual report of mortality. That music changed into both non-public and normal. The notebooks that he persevered to fill at some point of these years screen a mind grappling music, with more and more philosophical questions about the character of existence and human cognizance. His in-advance investigations have been driven by practical interest music, about how things labored, However, his very last writings display him pondering why something existed in any respect. What purpose may the problematic mechanisms he had spent a lifetime reading? These meditations on the which means of existence and loss of life gave his final scientific observations a poetic nice that outstanding them from his in advance, more technical writings. On May 2, 1519, in the quiet chambers of Leonardo da Vinci drew his final breath. The fingers that had painted the Mona Lisa's enigmatic smile, that had sketched flying machines centuries before their time, that had dissected human heart's music, to understand the very essence of life itself, subsequently came to relaxation. King Francis I, who had rushed to be at his mentor's bedside, would later declare that Leonardo died in his arms. A fitting quit for a relationship that had transcended the same old barriers between customer and artist, to become something approaching real knowledge between kindred spirits. The dying of Leonardo marked greater than the passing of a single incredible man or woman. With him died the Renaissance ideal of the prevalent genius, the belief that one mind could embody all human know-how and push the boundaries of every subject. Simultaneously, the world turning into too complex, too specialized for such complete mastery ever to be achieved again. Music, Leonardo changed into possibly the closing human being who ought to legitimately declare expertise in artwork. Music, technological know-how, engineering, anatomy, structure, tune, and philosophy, without every person questioning his credentials in any of those domain names. But in some other experience, Leonardo's demise changed into no longer an finishing, but a beginning. The notebooks he left in the back of Music, filled with reflect writing and revolutionary insights, could inspire generations of thinkers and creators who accompanied. His artistic techniques would have an impact on painters for hundreds of years, whilst his medical observations could be rediscovered and confirmed by using music, researchers operating with contraptions he should by no means have imagined. The flying machines that appeared like fantasies in 1519, Music, would take to the skies 4 centuries later. Designed in keeping with principles, he had first articulated music through careful remark of birds in flight. Leonardo's finest gift to humanity, music, may not have been any single painting or invention, but instead his demonstration that the human thoughts,